I woke up strapped to the back of the motorhome bed.
Her mother continued to take her to see him even after he had kidnapped her.
How does a family friend abduct a 12-year-old girl with the knowledge of her unsuspecting parents, drug, and repeatedly molest her, have an affair with her mom, engage in sexual relations with her father, and blackmail them into dropping all charges, all the while maintaining his position as a friend of the family? But that's not all. He managed to kidnap her for the second time. This is the story of Jan Broberg, a young girl from the little town of Pocatello, Idaho. Born on the 31st of July, 1962, Jan Broberg was the first of the 3 daughters of Bob and Mary Ann Broberg. Speaking of her family, Jan said, "I had a wonderful childhood until I was 12. My parents and we ate dinner together. We talked about everything. We were loved unconditionally." Her parents were Christians and members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Though naive at the time, her parents made sure their girls were loved and raised them in line with the values of their church. Jan's family met the Berchtold family in their church in 1972, and they instantly became close friends, spending countless hours and days together with each family member having a corresponding friend. They were so close that Jan and her sisters started calling Robert Berchtold Dad, or B, because to them he was like a second father. He was the kind of guy that was just helpful, Broberg said of her childhood impressions of B. Everybody loved him. Berchtold, or B, with time, gained so much of the Brobergs' trust that he began to manipulate them. He started by making advances on Jan's mother, Mary Ann. He also managed to convince Bob Broberg, Jan's father, to jerk him off when he needed it. Both parents were too trusting and naive, and B knew, so he took as much advantage of them as he could. Although Jan was just a little girl, B fancied her and somehow convinced himself that they were meant to be. To get close to her, he convinced her parents that for his therapeutic reasons, he needed to sleep on her bed with her. The family trusted him, and since he was always so kind, they didn't suspect that he might have had ulterior motives. But here's what they didn't know. B had a dark secret. He lied to and tricked everyone around him. His family, his friends, and even the police. He used his charm, his money, his power, and his lies to get what he wanted. He seemed to always succeed with his schemes, as the Brobergs saw nothing wrong in his unusual closeness with their daughter Jan. It would later be revealed that Berchtold liked kids in the wrong way. At one point, a doctor told him to stay away from kids and spend more time with his own kids, but clearly, B did not listen. He had always gotten what he wanted. This wouldn't be any different. B had been crazy about Jan since he first saw her. He thought she was his true love. He even said God told him he had to marry her and do a special mission with her. He desperately needed an undisturbed moment with Jan, so he made a plan to kidnap Jan. He also planned to make her fall in love with him. It was a sick plan, but not to him. He built a small motorhome with a hidden place where he could hide Jan and take her to different places. He also had a tape recorder with a voice that pretended to be an alien. The voice was to manipulate Jan into believing she had to do a mission with B or the world would end. With that, he had everything ready to carry out his evil plan. He just needed to find the perfect opportunity. And what better time to do it than a private outing with Jan? That day, B took Jan on a supposed horseback ride, which took longer than it should have. After a whole day of not seeing their daughter, Mary Ann went to Berchtold's house to look for her, but only met his wife, who pleaded for her not to call the police. It was at this point that both Mary and her husband began to suspect that something was not right about the attention he had been showing their eldest daughter. The crazy thing is, even after this realization, they were still confident that he would not hurt her. They went on to stay for an additional 4 days before reporting to the police, making it 5 days since Jan went missing. For the next 5 weeks, Jan was held captive by B in his motorhome, while he continued to sexually abuse her and brainwash her with the alien mission. He told her that they had to travel to Mexico, where they could get married legally even as Jan was just 12. He also told her that they had to consummate their marriage as soon as possible, or else the aliens would destroy the planet. He made her wear a wedding ring and call him husband. He also gave her a fake birth certificate that said she was 18. Meanwhile, the Brobergs were frantic with worry and grief. After reporting Jan's disappearance to the police, they encountered many obstacles and delays in the investigation. They also received several phone calls from B, who claimed that he and Jan had run away together and that they were happy. He tried to convince them to drop the charges against him and let him be with Jan. He also threatened to harm Jan if they didn't cooperate. The Brobergs were confused and terrified, and they didn't know what to do. Fortunately, the FBI managed to track down B and Jan in Mexico, and they arrested B for kidnapping and child molestation. They also rescued Jan and brought her back to her parents. However, Jan was no longer the same girl that they knew. She was brainwashed and traumatized, so much so that she developed Stockholm Syndrome phenomenon, a psychological phenomenon that occurs when a victim of kidnapping or a hostage forms a bond with their captor, as a way of coping with the trauma and surviving the ordeal. Stockholm Syndrome can affect anyone, regardless of age, gender, or background, and it can have lasting effects on the victim's mental and emotional health. Little Jan was convinced that B was her true love and that the alien mission was real. She refused to talk to the police or the doctors, and she begged her parents to let her see B. She also feared that the aliens would kill her and her family if she didn't complete the mission with B. She was in a state of denial and delusion, and she needed professional help. But despite it all, B was not going to give up on Jan, as he had more tricks up his sleeve. He managed to get out of jail using his influence to pay a bail of $1,000, returned to the US, and then contacted the Brobergs again, blackmailing them into dropping the charges and letting him see Jan. You might think that after the first abduction, the Brobergs would have cut off all contact with B and protected Jan from him, but sadly, that was not the case. B was so good at manipulating them that he managed to convince them that there was not a threat and that he only wanted to be friends with Jan. He was so good with his antics that he even got them to sign an affidavit that stated that Jan had gone with him willingly and that they had given their consent. This affidavit would later be used by B to avoid prosecution and extradition. He also convinced the naive parents that he had been cured of his pedophilia by a therapist. He was so persuasive and cunning that he eventually won over the Brobergs' trust again. He even got permission to visit Jan at her school, and he gave her gifts and letters. He also continued to reinforce the alien mission story, and he told her that they had to run away together again. He was preparing for his second abduction of Jan. He was just waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment came 2 years after the first abduction, on August 10, 1976, when B called the Brobergs and told them that he had enrolled Jan in a summer program at a Catholic school in California. He said that he had arranged everything and that he would take Jan there and bring her back. He also said that it would be good for Jan to get away from the town and the rumors, and that it would help her heal from the trauma. The Brobergs, who were still under B's influence, agreed to let him take Jan. They didn't know that it was all a lie and that B had no intention of taking Jan to a school, at least not a summer school. He had actually rented an apartment in Pasadena where he planned to keep Jan as his prisoner and wife. B took Jan to the apartment and he locked her in. He told her that they had to stay there until the aliens gave them further instructions. He also told her that they had to have sex every day, or else the aliens would kill them. He kept her isolated and controlled, and he didn't let her go outside or talk to anyone. He also gave her a fake ID that said she was 18, and he changed her name to Janice Marie Bunnell. He told her that they had to pretend to be married and that they had to act normal in front of the neighbors. He also enrolled her in a drama school, with the hopes that she would become a famous actress. He was living his fantasy with Jan, while the Brobergs and the authorities were looking for them. This was the second time that B abducted Jan, and it would last for 4 months. This was the longest and most terrifying ordeal that Jan had to endure. After much effort to get him and rescue Jan, B was arrested for the second time in California in January 1977, after the FBI tracked him down and rescued Jan again. He was charged with kidnapping and child molestation, and he faced a possible 20 years in prison. However, he managed to get out of jail by paying a $5,000 bail, and he returned to his family and his business. This was not so difficult because he also used the affidavit that the Brobergs had signed, and he claimed that Jan had gone with him willingly and that they had given their consent. He also used his religious visions and revelations, and he claimed that he had a divine mandate to be with Jan and that he was following God's will. He used these arguments and more to avoid prosecution and extradition. However, B stood trial the second time in Utah in June 1977 for kidnapping and child molestation. He pleaded not guilty, and he faced a possible 15 years in prison. But he managed to get a plea bargain, and he agreed to plead guilty to 1 count of rape in exchange for dropping the other charges. He also agreed to undergo a mental evaluation and to serve 1 year in a mental hospital, agreeing to stay away from Jan and her family and to never contact them again. He was sentenced to 1 year in a mental hospital and 5 years of probation. To many, it was an unfair judgment following the suffering Jan and her family must have passed through, but then again, the affidavit and his claims of mental illness played a role in his sentencing. B wasn't normal, and he proved it again. Despite the lesser punishment he was given, he violated his parole several times by contacting Jan and her family, wanting to reconnect again. He also left the state without permission, failed to report to his parole officer, and committed other crimes. B was arrested and jailed several times, but he always managed to get out by paying a fine, by appealing to a judge, or by using his connections and influence. He also continued to harass and stalk Jan and her family, trying to convince them to join him in his religious cult. He still claimed that he and Jan were meant to be together and that he was following God's will. He never gave up on his obsession with Jan, and he never showed any remorse or regret for his crimes. Unfortunately, he was never really brought to justice, and he never faced the full consequences of his crimes. He died in 2005 at the age of 70 from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Apparently, he committed suicide after he learned that he was going to be arrested again for another case of child molestation. He took his own life before he could be held accountable for his actions. He escaped the law, but he did not escape the truth. He died as a coward, a criminal, and a pedophile. He died as a monster, and he left behind a legacy of pain and suffering. So, you might be wondering how B was able to abduct Jan twice, and why the Brobergs were so naive and trusting of him. To understand this, we need to go back to the background of the abduction and explore the circumstances surrounding Jan's first and second kidnappings. B was not a stranger to the Brobergs. He was a member of their church and a close friend of their family. He had a wife and 5 children, and he seemed to be a respectable and successful businessman. He owned a furniture store and a flower shop, and he was involved in several community projects. He was charming, charismatic, and generous, and he had a way of making people feel comfortable and special. He was especially good at befriending children, and he had a knack for finding out their interests and hobbies. He was the kind of person that everyone liked and trusted. B was also a master manipulator and strategist. He had studied the psychology of persuasion, and he had learned how to use various techniques to influence people's behavior and emotions. He used flattery, compliments, gifts, favors, and promises to win over the Brobergs' trust and affection. He also used guilt, threats, blackmail, and lies to coerce them into doing what he wanted. He had exploited their weaknesses, their fears, their insecurities, and their religious beliefs. He also created a web of deception and confusion and had them isolated from their friends and relatives. He made them dependent on him and made them doubt their own judgment. He had essentially brainwashed them, and he had made them his accomplices in his crimes against their family. B also used his family as a cover for his crimes. He pretended to love his wife and children, but he abused and neglected them. He also involved them in his schemes and made them lie for him and cover for him. He threatened them with violence and his wife with divorce if they ever exposed him or betrayed him. He also convinced them that he was doing everything for their own good and that he was following God's will. He made them his victims as well as his enablers. He also used his church as a shield for his crimes. He had pretended to be a devout and faithful member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but he violated its teachings and principles. He used his church connections and influence to gain access to Jan and her family and to avoid suspicion and detection. He also used his church doctrine and culture of forgiveness to manipulate the Brobergs and Jan and to justify his actions. He took advantage of the Brobergs' naivety and trust and exploited Jan's innocence and vulnerability. During the abductions, B would often drug Jan with sleeping pills and allergy medication to make her unconscious and compliant. He also gave her vitamins and supplements that he claimed were from the aliens, but were laced with sedatives and hormones. he used drugs to impair Jan's memory, judgment, and resistance. He also brainwashed Jan using the alien mission, a complex and elaborate story that he made up to convince her that she had to marry him and have his child. He used a tape recorder with a voice that pretended to be an alien, and he played it to Jan when she was drugged and confused. He also repeated the story to her every day, and he made her write it down in a journal. He used the alien mission to manipulate Jan's emotions, beliefs, and behavior. B isolated Jan from her family, friends, and society. He kept her in his motorhome or his apartment, and he didn't let her go outside or talk to anyone. He also cut off her communication with her parents, and he lied about where they were and what they were doing. When he enrolled her in a drama school, he didn't let her interact with her classmates or teachers. He used isolation to make Jan dependent on him and to prevent her from getting help or escaping. Threats weren't left out of his elaborate schemes. B threatened Jan with violence and death if she didn't obey him or tried to escape. He also threatened to harm her family and her sister if she didn't complete the mission. He also threatened to expose her parents' secrets and affairs if they didn't cooperate with him. Recall that he had an 8-month affair with her mom, Marianne, and sexual relations with her dad. Both were committed Christians and didn't want the news of such acts to get to the public. He used threats to instill fear and guilt in Jan and her family, and to deter them from reporting him or resisting him, all the while molesting Jan repeatedly and systematically, starting from when she was only 12 years old. He was indeed a ruthless and cunning predator who preyed on Jan's innocence and vulnerability, and who exploited her family's trust and naivety. He was a monster, and he had to be stopped, and he was, at least for a while. The abductions and abuse that Jan suffered had a profound and lasting impact on her life, both psychologically and emotionally. She had to deal with the trauma and the aftermath of her ordeal, and she had to face the challenges and struggles that came with it. Unfortunately, Jan had to go through so much. Jan developed PTSD, a mental health condition that occurs after a traumatic event like kidnapping, violence, or sexual assault. She also had triggers that reminded her of the abuse, such as certain sounds, smells, or places. She had to undergo therapy and medication to cope with her PTSD, and according to research, she still suffers from it to this day. Jan also dealt with trust issues, dissociation, and self-esteem issues as a result of the abuse and torture she underwent. She also felt ashamed and guilty for what had happened to her, and she blamed herself for the abuse. She had to overcome the negative beliefs and feelings that B had instilled in her and reclaim her identity and her worth. The Broberg and Berchtold families also had their own fair share of everything. Both families were involved in the abductions and the abuse, either as victims, accomplices, or enablers. Both families had to deal with the consequences and the repercussions of the crimes, and they had to face the public scrutiny and the media attention. Both families had to cope with the trauma and the healing, and they had to find a way to move on and forgive. The story of Jan Broberg and her abductions is not only a shocking and disturbing true crime, but also a wake-up call for society to recognize and prevent child abuse and molestation. According to the World Health Organization, 1 in 5 women and 1 in 13 men report having been sexually abused as a child. Child sexual abuse has serious and long-lasting consequences for the victims, their families, and their communities, such as physical, mental, and sexual health problems, substance abuse, criminal behavior, and intergenerational trauma. Jan's story has since been told to the public multiple times in various forms. It was first told in a memoir published by her and her mother in 2003. As a true crime documentary film, it was first released in 2017, titled Abducted in Plain Sight, and directed by Skye Borgman, and was premiered on Netflix in 2019. Today, Jan Broberg has a wonderful relationship with her parents. She learned to forgive them through therapy. "I had my moments of being angry and upset," Broberg said about her initial resentment towards her parents. "But I knew they had been groomed and manipulated too." While the gruesomeness of the story is undeniable, it is hard to comprehend how a young girl could be kidnapped twice by the same man, who was a trusted family friend, and how her parents could be so naive and manipulated by him. This case raises many questions and challenges us to think critically about the issues of child abuse, molestation, and Stockholm Syndrome. How can we prevent such crimes from happening? How can we support the victims and survivors and help them heal? How can we hold the perpetrators accountable and seek justice? And how can we raise awareness and empathy for such cases in our society? We hope you enjoyed watching this video and learned something new from it. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories. We would love to hear your thoughts and opinions on this case, so please leave a comment below and join the discussion. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for our next video. Bye.